may think that women are more liberated, but we can see today that the relationship with the body, with the desire in Morocco is not. It's quite complex, and it's hard to know how you can become a woman in such a country. And the answer is not so clear. And I also wanted to change this idea of what we always say, the Arabic woman, the Muslim woman, and all the cliches that are related to this. We only have women with their origins. Well, I feel Parisian, I feel Moroccan, I feel like I have many cultures. But I think that talking about the Arabic woman doesn't mean anything. Well, to talk about, well, you have more experience, and what has changed in the recent years for women of the Arabic world, and maybe in Jordan and also in the Middle East. Do you agree with what Zineb just said? Do you see the same things?
Patriarchy keeps me awake at night. All the way from the United States to Iran. Patriarchy is a challenge for women and for Arab women. What I try to do in my writing is to disrupt the master narrative, the male narrative, and lift women from the margins and put them in the center. Because I feel that their experiences were not documented, are not part of the dominant narrative. So I created all these women and their stories. The other thing is femicide, which I deal with in My Name is Salma. Imagine living with a sword above your head and it's gonna fall at any minute. And it is random justice and it is the law of the jungle. And when you are living in such conditions, you have to perform and live your life. And how do you do that? How do you do that? So I wanted to immortalize women by writing My Name is Salma and creating and dramatizing the story of a woman who is being pursued and is going to be killed for an alleged crime, for a crime of honor. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to hear the voices of the women who get buried without even the names on the graves. I want to see their names engraved one day in one of the squares. So yes, it is fiction and it has to be literary and it's got to be pleasing and it's got to be enjoyable, but it needs to do something.
Et par rapport justement à la situation de la femme.
And as regards the situation of women in Jordan or in the Middle East, do you think that there is an evolution, a development, maybe since you've been writing your book, My Name is Salima? Have things changed?
Yes, I think things have changed. And it's interesting, the Arab world. If you look at the Arab world, there are pockets, there are socioeconomic variables. In some sections, women are doing very well. In other sections, women are going back. I don't know. One of the issues that I'm looking at, and I looked at for the United Nations, is how much we own. So this property does not own property. Yeah? So I looked at the figures, and I can tell you there is an improvement. So about 30% improvement in ownership of businesses and property. So things are changing. And also there are fantastic women writers now coming out of Jordan and the Arab world. And I'd like to mention some of them. I'd like to mention Najwa bin Shatwan from Libya. I'd like to mention Kafar Zuabi from Jordan. And I'd like to mention Inam Kachachi, Iraq. So they are writing their own story. So self-representation is the key. And I remember in The Handmaid's Tale, when she clicked that pin and unleashed the words. It is important to click that pin and unleash the words.
Oui, bien sûr, Zineb, parce que la question aussi.
Yes, of course, because we also have the question of women emancipation in your novel. And well, I totally agree with what and what it means, then I can live the life of the caste society in India because I've read the book of Adim Ratiroy. So, how can we intimately try to change our vision of the world? Because we, in this way, we can be in in their own shoes of the protagonists. So, as regards emancipation in because after 10 years of Islamists that were, they have lost many seats. And now the youth in general want to change the penal code, which is outdated, and also the civil code, which is outdated. And I think that there is a momentum now in Morocco. And I went to Morocco in June in order to promote my book, and I had no expectations. And when I arrived, I met many interesting people, and also many women who came after driving for 1 hour and say, "Oh, thank you. I really enjoyed your book. I feel less lonely." Or men who said that they bought this book for their daughters, but also for their sons. And it shows that we are talking about something that is very contemporary and very intimate. And I really hope that things will change, and I know that things will change because civil societies are doing a lot. When we talk about women emancipation, we can also talk about it, and they are very important topic in your book. I would like to know what are the relationships of your protagonist with the religion in those secular countries, for instance, in your trees, in your whip.
Thank you for that question. I just want to say, Zainab, that I totally agree with what you said about Moroccan women, and it applies to Jordanian women because the penal code is being changed. Things are change is coming. Maybe not soon enough. As for religion, because it's a quite sensitive subject, I tackled it in a different way. In My Name is Salma, you have the two extremes. You've got a missionary Christian who takes her out of the country to save her life and tries to impose her own vision on Salma. And when she arrives in the UK, she meets a Quaker priest, inclusive, not priest, but a Quaker, inclusive, kind, understanding. What I wanted to show are the two extremes, the missionary vis-a-vis the true believer. And in Willow Trees Don't Weep, because I have an Islamist who is muta'aslim, using religion for political reasons. That's one. Then the true believer, the grandmother, the sincere believer, the kind, the inclusive, the spiritual woman, mother who actually reacted against the father leaving to basically becomes a terrorist. I wanted the title to be The Terrorist Daughter, but the British publishing establishment couldn't deal with that. So they went for Willow Trees Don't Weep, so you can buy it at the airport. So my name, Fadia Fakir, and Terrorist Daughter, no. Richard Smith, Terrorist Daughter, perfect. what happens to the women that are left behind when someone and joins a cause? So the wife becomes completely secular, against religion, and starts setting fire to all the books related to theology, to Islam. What I wanted to show is that tension between the three. And believe you me, if you go to Arab houses, not all Arab houses, you would find a similar tension, a similar dialogues. So the dialogues are happening, but representing them and writing about them is so dangerous. You get penalized. So you don't encounter many secular characters in fiction. In a kind of, again, not a native informed. The country loves the people and is writing out of love.
Merci. Vous, Zinab, il y a une autre grande idée qui traverse votre roman.
So for you, there is also another idea in your book, that is to say social inequalities within Morocco. And even if the society is becoming more and more modern, it is still very strict. So in your book, we have two different heroes. And how would you like to define the different class relationships in Morocco, and what is it necessary to do in the future? I wanted to show that Fadia represents what really happens within the different households in Morocco. And we can find the same concept of shuma, that is to say, the shame, social shame. And I frequently say that the point of view, the vision of the author is like, we don't only stop to violence, social violence and pain when we become adult. We tend to have a different vision. I don't know if you've ever visited Casablanca in Morocco, but there are some kids, when I used to go back there, giving me some candy and chewing gums. And in my mind, I was just able to think, well, I could be this guy, but I was lucky enough, actually, not to find myself in the same situation. And so I decided to base my story actually also on this personal experience. And I do not remember the second question, what it is necessary to have in order to have more equality. Well, maybe a greater number of authors and writers and a greater awareness, because there is also a kind of vision in Morocco that is full of wisdom. But sometimes we just say, okay, it is what it is. I cannot do anymore. And this is not totally positive, because in one passage of my book, I say that there is this girl having a love affair with a Spanish doctor. And I write in the book, we can do whatever we want with our lives. So where we born, and when we born, do not define who we are and what we want to be. So especially women in Morocco, do not understand actually that they can do whatever they want in their lives, that there are no obstacles, let's say. And thanks to literature, we can also change this point of view. So unfortunately, we don't have more time right now. So I can just encourage you to read these two different books. And thank you so much for your attention.
a private one. And the second is that partial rights will be sufficient in terms of kind of referring the social contract. So could you tell us a little bit more about this dual bet and how you see in the landscape that Roberta has talked about?
Right. Yeah, it's an interesting question to, and I can be a bit less diplomatic than Roberta, I think.
Please.
Talk about that. So for example, what we could contrast is the approach of, on the one hand, Morocco and Saudi Arabia, which is to really on the economy and on creating a private sector, on creating growth before doing any political reform, as opposed to, say, the cases of Egypt and Tunisia, where for various political reasons, the focus have been very much on politics in the past 10 years and not at all on the economy. So, and it's interesting to put Egypt and Tunisia in the same bag because, the political bet was extremely different. On the one case, it is very much coming after the comeback of the military and how to organize the polity and involve the security. And so the economy had to follow. And so it's an economy dominated by the army, with big investment in infrastructure, in new cities, much exports, based a lot on stabilization. I mean, there was an IMF program, there's discipline, but also external borrowing, debt rising, the private sector playing a very minimal role, in private investment, 5, 6, 7% of GDP, kind of Nasserist levels. Yeah. So not at all focus on the economy. And similarly in Tunisia, for a completely different reason. I mean, to make this competitive economy work, you have power sharing, unable to make decisions even that Egypt could make on stabilization. So big deficits, borrowing again, private investors getting afraid, private investment falling, the economy getting in bad shape, debts rising. So most countries are in a very unsustainable situation. That kind of bet to deal with politics first and with the economy later didn't seem to have worked. On the other hand, the configuration that we have, Morocco and Saudi Arabia, two very different countries, one of the poorest, one of the richest of the region, somehow similar bets. Let's freeze politics for the moment and really invest in the economy. And, hopefully a richer society will be able to improve politically. Does that work? I mean, here, investment is very high in both countries, around perhaps 30% of GDP or so. So a big national effort to invest and grow, and that demands a very tight governance, top-down. This would work or not? Because, as you said, it's dangerous. Can you control the private businesses that you're creating? Can you control society so it doesn't explode? Well, it depends enormously on the quality of the management of this investment. This is the way Asia grew, the Asian miracle, but it's based on excellent management of that effort. How good is the management would determine here what goes, because after all, you have a lot of rent seeking, so that this investment goes to enrich particular people. You may have a tendency when growth is not very good to put pressure on society so it doesn't rebel and to make friends with businesses that are loyal rather than performant, to kind of block the opposition, crony capitalism. And, indeed, in both countries, even though there are progress, it's not commensurate with the effort. I mean, the growth rates are not commensurate with 30% plus investment. And so I think there's a question mark about whether this strategy will work. But, the key is, I think, the quality of the management, which is quite... So two very different political economies.
Yeah, two very, very different styles. Yeah. And, Roberta, you've written about kind of the quality of management and the importance of quality of management in the role of the firm. And I know you have to go, but if you maybe could say one or two things. Do you have a moment? I mean, I think it's a nice segue to think
Happily.
about. Yeah.
So Ishaq was talking about, which is how these different, well, not only different priority of politics vis-a-vis economy, but also it's really about the how it is done. So how do you get to good management? One parenthesis, internationally, quality of management accounts by some estimates of for 30% of the differences in total factor productivity across countries. So there's something just there that is very important. What I think Ishaq was saying is that you need to have excellent management if you have a strong sort of directive from above type of intervention. A way to get good management is also to have this type of feedback mechanisms that I was talking when I was saying cross the river by filling the stones. So that's more a sort of grassroots approach that doesn't bet on exceptional leadership, but the process that might not be perfect, might not be linear, but as a way to course correct. And this is a bit the risk of strongly centralized, directive from above type of investment. They are bets that are very risky because if they get it right very fast and very well. But if they don't get it right, they don't have that feedback mechanism to course correct. So there's definitely something to it and different modalities to go about it. Eventually, given heightened uncertainty, I think that the risk of choosing from above and hoping that the manager is taking a high risk because uncertainty has increased. So I still would bet eventually for a system where management is based on objective feedback and ways to react to those feedback by changing the course. But I don't know if you agree, Chris.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think
Ishaq, especially.
I mean, I think that feedback mechanism is the part in the dual bet. It's the feedback mechanism that might be lacking if you think about top-down political control. And what we know about these types of political systems is oftentimes the feedback mechanism is weak.
I may to add one last footnote before I unfortunately have to leave this conversation that promises to be so interesting, at least for someone like myself, is that I'm not even talking about democracy versus autocracy, or I'm not even talking about governments being larger or smaller. There are examples in the world of non-democracies that have adopted this mechanism of sort of getting grassroots innovation and change, adaptive change to investment and economic growth. So I'm making a sort of apolitical type of statement, which I think is possible. And the last thing is that it's also very cheap to do. And in a macroeconomic moment when fiscal stance is super tight, at least for oil importing countries, is the right moment to do it. And for the countries that are now swimming in oil, it's the moment to do it for them to experiment what could work for their economies. So I'm so sorry that I have to conclude here.
Thank you so much for being with us. We really appreciate it.
And I'll watch the video.
Great, fantastic. Thank you very much. Maybe if I'll take a chance to home in on the case of Morocco for a moment and turn to Dr. Karima Ainoui, who's the president of the Policy Center for the New South. And so Ishaq has said a few things kind of about the Moroccan model, but maybe you could tell about the macroeconomic and political environment in Morocco. And then I'm particularly interested in, and this has been mentioned, but it hasn't come up in detail, the idea of the NEET, so the people who are not in education, training, and this youth bulge, and sort of absorbing these people into the labor market, and what that means for the transformation of the social contract. So could you perhaps say a few things about that?
Thank you. Yes, well, let's a few words about context first. We're in 2022, looking at the region and specific countries like Morocco and others. Years have been quite challenging in terms of policy making. Let's remember 2007, the financial crisis, and then we had 2011, responding to the demand from population across the regions. There were of course, again, shocks, commodity prices, oil, food, COVID. It has been challenging. It has been challenging for all society, and this discussion is not happening in a vacuum. It's happening in a context and in a world. It has been challenging for liberal democracies with very strong polarization of electorate, people not even able to talk to each other. And how countries have reacted has to do with much deeper issues, basically in the reptilian brain of all nations. We are the produce of histories. You know, Moroccans are not Lebanese, are not Americans. It means something. So the nation state means something. It's culture, call it whatever you want. And politics is the produce of that. And if you look at how the region, and I forgot, conflicts, Libya, the aftermath of Iraq 2003, Syria. I mean, this is well, and you know, and so how a country like Morocco has sort of lived through that and, you know, responded to that. I think one of the lessons is that you need a functioning state that delivers. I mean, you can describe it as you want, but, you know, let's not get into this, you know, liberal, democracy, whatever, but you need a functioning state that delivers. And we've seen this in COVID. You need to deliver health services, vaccines, protect, and then there's a demand for that. And I think across the region, the responses of the various states were very diverse. You know, some couldn't deliver basic health services, and you need at the same time to have you know, a solid macroeconomic policy. Let's remember, a country like Morocco had an excess surplus in its fiscal balance in 2007, and debt was below 50%. Today, it has doubled, basically. Same everywhere. Remember, G20 countries, many of them, you know, even G7 countries are above 100% GDP ratio to debt. So it has doubled because of this response. So now, of course, the space is narrower. And the question, and I think, what to do? What to do given who you are? I think it's important to know who we are, and that's why important that economists should get together with funds are not in a vacuum again. You know, the Washington consensus or whatever we think is the consensus today to do happens somewhere in a country again. And what are your legal structure, how you're organized? Are you an old state? Do you have a practice of government? Do you have reasonable government policy? This is not the case around the region. And so I am very interested in that. How can I talking about, you know, experimenting in public policies? It's very difficult for some government to experiment. They want to have the right policy for the whole country in one by region, fail, and data-based, you know, evidence-based public policy making that was said by the World Bank. But this is, again, not happening in a vacuum. It's about politics. This is not KPIs, work, you know, spreadsheets. No, it has to do with the rapport de force in a country, and we have to be very mindful of that. So I think my sense is that today, and we've produced under, you know, Itzhak has led with some friends, a commission that is a story about the region from the region, which is interesting. It's a report about, you know, what to do now, and I think. It has interesting ideas, and particularly this idea that it needs to combine, you know, sound economic policy. It needs to combine what do we do with this debt, particularly from specific countries that have serious issues on debt, and though we unlock the potential, but it has to be very mindful of what are the countries. And I think that there's no such thing as a narrative about the Middle East or North Africa. I can pass the countries from Morocco all the way to Lebanon, etc. So that would be my advice, that we need, and this is the Med conference, so we're part of the Mediterranean, it means something. It needs to have a framework for these policies in the spirit of cooperation that works. I can give one very specific example and I'll stop here. It's energy, renewable energy. It's something that, you know, is of the utmost importance and even has to do with national securities for most countries. There is some stuff we can do together. There are, as of today, very interesting connections through value chains in specific industry. If I talk about Morocco, in the aeronautic mobile sector. You can take, Tunisia has also some in those industries. So there are very specific stuff we can do together, and I'm not sure that a broad sort of view that is quite generic of let's not fall again in the trap of the 90s. There is a sort of recipe for now. It's look how it is difficult between advanced economies, how it is difficult to reach consensus in Europe, how it is difficult between Europe, US and China. So I want us to be a little bit modest and also deeply understand what are the countries, and that there are no blanket approaches. They can only be very specific, but we can find unlocking to sort of ignite a positive dynamic. It's easy. It's not as easy as in any country for specific region where you have conflict. Of course, it's more difficult.
I really agree with you in thinking about this. There's no one-size-fits-all solution, but there might be entry points with which we can kind of think about some of these issues. And three of the things that have come out of the conversation so far is, a respect for the history, the tradition, and understanding of kind of the context in which you're operating. The second is, knowing what's the capacity for change. And then the third is this issue around measurement and how do you actually measure change, and not these kind of one-size-fits-all KPIs, but really context-specific methods of measurement. This might be one of the ways to start direction. You said one thing about debt and debt financing, and I'm tempted to go back to Isak, but I'm going to wait because I want to turn a little bit to think about some of the places that we haven't talked about so much, keeping with this trend that there certainly is no one-size-fits-all, because there are places that are suffering and suffering greatly, and I think Lebanon is a case in point, right? So a case really of a failed model. And we haven't really talked at all about social identity, and identity fits into the social contract. We've talked a lot about the macroeconomics and about the politics. So I wanted to turn to Joseph Bahout, who's the director of the Some Fairs Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University of Beirut, and maybe to say a few words about, obviously, a really different in Lebanon right now. Could you say some things about what's happening there and the evolution of kind of thinking about identity politics in the region in the years to come?
Thank you, Christina, and thank you for the Med Forum. It's a very important gathering here. In fact, actually, I'll probably talk a little bit about Lebanon, but mainly also bounce back. I agree with the general line that it's much of a case-by-case situation, but also there are certain basic things. I'm here probably the only non-purely economist on the stage. I'm more of a political scientist. So probably I would also take this opportunity to come back to certain fundamentals, both the issue of political economy, the social contract, but also on political sociology and political philosophy. For me, as a political scientist, when you say social contract, it's not the literature of the World Bank or the IFIs and etc. It's mainly Rousseau, Locke, and Hobbes, and etc. It's mainly political philosophy. What is a social contract for us? Is a transactional relation between people and something that they will call after that the state, after having created the state. The state is not something important. And here I agree with you, the state is crafted by people according to situations, context, and etc. But what is this transactional exchange? On the one hand, it's the delivery of material things like social protection, human protection, physical protection, security, performance, roads, electricity, etc., health. But on the other hand, and this is what's maybe a little bit forgotten, and we come back to identity, there's a symbolic good that is being transacted between states and citizens themselves in a social contract. And here it's more issues like recognition, the recognition of people, of their individuality, the recognition of groups also, be them, primordial groups or not. It's the recognition of dignity, of inclusiveness, of the right to participate, to ask, hold people accountable, etc., etc. Now, if you look at the MENA region, and here I think it's not anymore a case by case. It's a one size fits all. One of the main problems of the social contract in the MENA region is that it was mainly focused on the first part, on the part of, okay, I deliver goods, but the other real part, the symbolic part, is completely forgotten. This is what created in the literature of the World Bank and IFIs the concept of the authoritarian social pact, meaning I provide you with things, I feed you, I give you roads, I give you high-speed internet, I give you electricity, but you shut up. You don't have a word to say on the political scene, on the public sphere. And this is the contract that works, and it in a region because of the permanence and the success, be it direct or indirect. Now, our discussion here is happening in a vacuum, as you said. It's happening after 10 years or 11 years of something, for me, which is tremendous, which is the Arab Revolution cycle. Now, you like it or not, this is a very important event in history. It's something as fundamental as the end of the Ottoman Empire, the Nahda in the Levant, the 20s when the states were crafted, the 50s when regimes were changed, and as Ishaq said, when military came to power. This is as shaky as these events. Now, probably today's assessment is that this has come to an impasse and neo-authoritarianism has won again. The question is this victory of neo-authoritarianism based or predicated on the former type of social contract, meaning the authoritarian social pact, is durable or not? So if the questions of the symbolic aspect of the social pact, dignity, recognition, participation, inclusiveness, all this is not taken into account, is the social contract in the MENA region durable and etc.? I don't think so, because partly because, of course, the performance, let's say the KPI, if you want, is not anymore here. I mean, states are not anymore able to deliver. Second, because the fundamental of that is today over. I mean, we want it or not, in a way or another in the long term, we are in a post-rentier era in the region. So we have to find a new model. We have to find a new basic model, infrastructural model, a material model that will support the social pact, and without the inclusion of this symbolic part of the social contract, which for me is identity, and we come back to your question about identity. Identity, the problem of identity in this cycle of Arab revolution was twofold. Part of the revolutions in the Arab world in the last 12, 11 years was based on the quest for identity recognition by the people who were revolting against the state. Identity in the sense of who I am, what is my group, what are my rights, and etc. However, and this is the very fascinating paradox of Arab revolutions, identity was also used by the authoritarian states to quell some of the revolts. Syria is a case in point. The main argument, if you put aside other things, of the regime, of the authoritarian regime that is now prevailing in Syria, is that the identity of a group is at stake, is endangered, and we have to protect it at any cost and with any means. So identity played a very different role. This is why if we don't crack the nut of identity in today's debate, inside the social contract debate, I think we would be missing not only a performative issue, but a vital issue that would put societies at stake and probably reopen a cycle of instability in the future. To conclude, I would say that the trap and the danger when we manipulate the issue of identity is that we often think in terms of nation building. In fact, it's not as much a question of nation building. What is, I think, one of the impasses of the Arab political thought is that it has, it's been maybe more than 100 years that it's the case. It has been behind and looking for a model of nation building. This is something we imported from the European political thought in the 19th century. However, today the issue is not anymore there. People revolted in Tunis, in Egypt, in Libya, in Yemen, in Bahrain, in Syria, today in Lebanon, etc., not because they are looking for a collective identity. They are looking for a functional state. They are looking, and here I'll conclude with that, I mean, 10, 15 years ago, to come back to political science, a seminal book was published by one of our colleagues, Teda Skok-Paul, in Harvard. It was called Bringing the State Back In. We forgot the state, and the state is enough, if it's performed well and managed well, to produce both the material part of the contract and the social transaction and the symbolic one. So to ensure the production of goods and services, protection and etc., and to ensure the dignity, inclusion, participation, and what we could call democracy one day in the MENA region. Stop at that.
Yeah, no, thank you, Joseph. I think it's a couple of really interesting things that came out of what you said. One is that there is a tendency now, kind of on after the Arab uprisings, to remove the politics from the equation, and to remove, especially the identity politics from the equation. But I think, as tempting as that may be in some ways, I think it's dangerous, because I think these things always tend to reemerge. And I think one of the things that particularly that you hit on is this issue of dignity, and the concept of the state, right, as kind of regenerating and rebuilding the state, thinking less about nation building, more about state building. And I think it's an interesting opportunity, actually, to turn to Stefan Hertog, who's Associate Professor of Comparative Politics at the LSE, because you've written about these insiders and outsiders in the state. And one of the things I've talked about so far is kind of the balance within states, and how that balance both contributes to the capacity that the state has, and shapes the social contract as well. So in particular, you've written about this, the pathologies of these segmented market economies. And you've called this a particular variety of capitalism. Tell us about this variety of capitalism as you see it, and then how that shapes the relationship between business, state, society, labor, kind of bringing us full circle in this discussion about the social contract.
Yeah, thanks, Kristen. I think what I'll say, I'll pick up some of the themes that have been brought up already. I think one cross-cutting thing that's come through all the remarks is that the states are under-resourced across the region. So there are fiscal crises. They have historically promised a lot in their traditional social contract in terms of providing public goods, infrastructure, education, healthcare, jobs, very large public sector employment. And what's been happening is that those kind of formal commitments aren't there anymore. And then almost by default, what they've had emerging is a system of insiders and outsiders. So some insiders who still have access to the benefits, who still have state employment, or in the case of private sector firms who still have access to state protection, state subsidies, state contracts, and then an ever-growing segment of outsiders, both on the labor market and among firms who don't have that kind of access to a state that's really overstretched and overtaxed and can't live up to its promises anymore. And I think this fundamental distinction between insiders and outsiders is to some extent a feature of economies all around the world, but it's particularly deep and particularly rigid in the Arab world. And I think the different interests of insiders and outsiders. So on the one hand, people who are employed in the public sector very securely, not on great salaries, but with much better benefits than in the private sector, much higher job security, much better pensions arrangements. They have very different material interests from, say, who don't have access to that kind of state employment anymore, who often operate on the informal economy, so don't have social security, don't have job security, don't have pensions arrangements. Similarly, in the private sector, you have well-connected, protected firms, often politically connected to the regime. A small minority that's doing very well, often has immunities and abnormally high profits because of their connected insider position. And then a large army of outsiders who, again, often operate in the informal economy on the margin with very little security and very little opportunity. And I think this deep division between insiders who are still sort of connected to the fraying old social contract and outsiders makes for very, very divergent interests in society, both in the private sector and sort of the working class at large. And I think this is partially what explains why we've seen so little economic reforms that everyone could agree on, because insiders tend to defend their insider interests. Outsiders often want to become insiders. People who are informally employed on the labor market or unemployed, they don't demonstrate or ask for a better social security system or unemployment assistance. They ask for government jobs, right? So that's sort of the token around which so labor market politics is organized. And then when the government gives in and gives some of them government jobs because the squeaky wheel gets greased, the only thing that does is to slightly shift the boundary, to add a few more insiders to the insider constituency, but without changing the systems. You still have a deeply segmented system with people with very diverse interests, and a system that's also very highly unfair and highly unequal. And as always, this debate, is there too much state? Is there too little state? Are the economies, have they been liberalized too much or too little? And I think it's really the wrong question to ask, because we have too much state presence in some sectors, in some areas, and we have almost no state in other areas. So it's the uneven presence of the state and the very uneven protection that some people benefit from and others don't benefit to. And to move towards something like a new social contract that's more inclusive, I think some of the insider benefits have to actually be diluted. They have to be eroded to some extent, but on the other hand, there has to be much more inclusive welfare and support for outsiders. A more modern welfare system in the case of the labor market, unemployment insurance, active labor market policy, potentially wage subsidies, cash grants, all those things that other regions have experimented with that the Arab world is so far behind. But right now, I think we have those cartels of insiders, both in the private sector and the labor market, that make it very hard to come to that kind of new social contract.
Yeah, and sort of, diluting insider influence is never easy. So it's easy, and also kind of rolling out these benefits, the extent to which these things are very sticky, right? So you roll out these benefits, and you create a set of expectations, and
exactly,
and then and these norms are basically really, really difficult to change. So we've got limited time left, but just in kind of the last 5 minutes that we have left, I wanted to open it up to everybody else on the panel to kind of reflections and thoughts on what you've and anything else you might like to add. Isaac, maybe we can turn to you.
I think we made a lot of progress, but we're missing two elements.
What's missing? Tell us what's missing.
The two elements we're missing. One is the historical one that explains the specificities of the region. I mean, it's not genetic. And the second is where we are today and what are the challenges for the future. So very quickly on both, if I may. So on the first point, I mean, let's remember, we had these post-colonial states modernizing with lots of energy, lots of progress in the 50s and the 70s, the 80s, an inward-looking model, like everywhere else in the world, import substitution and the like everywhere else, collapsed in the 80s. Reforms, Washington Consensus and the like, debt reduction, it took 20 years. And there was a reform of the market. Markets were liberalized, but the polity was not liberalized. Big difference with Latin America. Aging autocrats with losing powers, myopic, trying to survive, created a very biased capitalism that Stefan just described. One that they could control, that one that was a kind of capitalism that was rather inefficient, where you be very close to the state or very far from the state. Nothing in the middle that is dynamic and the like. That takes us with some growth, nevertheless, to the Arab Spring, because there were no reforms. People have aspirations for something better. And then a chaotic 10 years after, where governments, to survive, spend a whole lot, but do not reform. And so we get to today, three extra shocks, Ukraine, interest rates rising, we're losing market access, there are pressures on the exchange rate, on the interest rate, and the debts are very high, especially in the oil importing countries. And actually, Lebanon explodes. Egypt and Tunisia are close to exploding. The IMF is trying to stabilize a little bit, but not with a big heart. I mean, they're kind of kicking the can down the road, small loans. The governments are not really willing or able to restructure the economy the way they should a priori. And so we have this report that you were talking about that says, we have a whole bunch of countries about to financially explode. They're not the only one. I mean, there's a debt tsunami, debt crisis tsunami coming, especially if interest rates keep rising across the developing world. Austerity. We think austerity could lead to a social explosion. It's not the right solution. The right solution is to do what hasn't been done for decades, which is grow out of the crisis. These societies are way below potential. Now it's written on the wall. For regimes to survive, they have to put in growth measures. A bit of austerity, but with growth measures, so people know that there is light at the end of the tunnel. They put effort in order to get in a better situation. The second big conclusion of the report is that there are lots of growth opportunities around now. Maybe unlike the past, because the region was never very good at exporting goods. You know, it couldn't compete with East Asia. But now the name of growth is green growth, it's digitalization, taking advantage of that. The private sector has grown this now. It didn't exist in the 80s. You know, let it flourish. It could take growth on these big opportunities forward. But this is not to be left to technical advisor to government. This is the job of politicians. And so this is back to Kristen, to your actually, title, to your theme here. There is a need for a new social contract, a social contract that allows this growth to happen, that creates a coalition of would-be winners and a way to pay off, if you like, the would-be losers. There are, many monopolies, cronies, polluting industries that won't survive, and they will resist all of that. And they have the means to lobby to resist, and they had resisted in the past. Politicians didn't create the kind of coalitions of the youth, of the educated, from this more inclusive growth that digitalization in particular could bring. And that coalitions need to be brought. Politicians' main job now is to actually put politically viable growth contracts together, what you call a social contract. And otherwise, and historically, we're in a very particular situation, at least in these 5-6 countries, where the alternative is actually austerity, poverty, and truly a poverty and chaotic trap, a little bit a la Lebanon, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree with you more. I think the austerity road is a bad road to go down. I mean, I think that that's a road for a social explosion. As tempting as it may be, kind of macroeconomically, to tighten the belt, you've got to grow out of this crisis. So I couldn't agree more. Let me ask our other panelists, maybe we've got about 3 minutes left, so maybe 1 minute each, and then we'll wrap it up there.
Yeah,
please.
Let me, a couple of ideas. First, you need, functioning state is a state that allows you also to manage tension and transitions in society at the lowest cost possible, which is democracy, and some countries I think have, and at that point, let me give you a couple of good news. I mean, we were talking and tell you a little bit what we do in Morocco, as a virtue of example, not a lesson. First of all, after this crisis, we are trying to generalize the social protection system, and it is being forced. And because we have a specific governance, we are able to force reforms and across on top of these different groups and that you called inside. And that is something that will reshape the fiscal policy. And that I think, and it is also a demand from populations. It includes, a national registry system where we will target with cash transfers and a much more efficient and transparent system of sort of social spending, not the kind of social spending that were described. And I think it is important. The third point I would like to make is about the youth. I have another hat, which is Dean at Economics and Behavioral Social Sciences. So I see the younger generation. I sit in interviews for them to enter our university, and we see every single student. And I can tell you that I want to reassure you, they are the fantastic upcoming generation. Well, I see them, they're not virtual. We see them every day at the university, professors see them. And this is 70% girl. We don't have time to, and this is in the whole higher education system in Morocco. You have 70%, 74, 75% of girls versus boys. We don't have time to explain why. There are a couple of explanations, but if you tend to be depressed, I would recommend that you take a course at a university in the region. I suppose it's the same everywhere. So we need to make them space. it is very important that we create space and safe spaces where they can express themselves. And I see university as safe space also to contribute to the future of this region and on all those those various countries. And they're having the kind of discussion we are having here. So it is important that we don't stay at a sort of higher view, helicopter view. And on insider and outsider, I'm sorry to say, but they are everywhere. Pork barrel has not been invented, in the region. It's the same everywhere. See the courageous and I think they're interesting reforms that were taken by the Biden administration on canceling the debt, billions and billions of debt. How would you qualify that? I mean, this is how societies work. They're glued there. We need to find mechanism. And again, they have to be efficient. They have to be transparent by a specific group. It is tough to do. It is difficult. And I'm hoping in the region where the IMF is having this on the table, because this is, this is not about the billions you're going to transfer. It's what you're going to do with it, how you're going to spend it, etc. What are the counterpart, So I think this.
Yeah, and I think it's your point that the insider-outsider dynamic, where I think it is well taken, and also clearing a path for the youth is like absolutely critical and maybe a bright spot. So we're up against the end of time. Maybe two quick end comments from Joseph and
yeah,
Stefan?
because Christian, you asked me about Lebanon, and it's not that I evaded it, but I tried to answer in a broader manner. On Lebanon, very quickly, 2 points related to our debate, because Lebanon is a multifaceted crisis. On the nature of the social contract first, social contract in Lebanon is mainly an elitist communal social contract. Okay, we have to keep this in mind. This is what was done in the 20s, in 43 to 40s by the Taif Agreement at the end of the war. It has built a very strong political system, but a very weak state. And we're back to our discussion. And the condition of having a very strong societal elitist communal pact is the fact that we have a very weak state. So this is why it's a sort of conundrum. And we will not have a strong state in Lebanon able to deliver a social contract like the system if this kind of system is as strong as resilient. Meaning that today, we have not only, and compared to other cases, not only we have the case of a state that is collapsing, but what's worrying, and for us every day, I mean, who live in Lebanon and work on public policy, is the full collapse of the public administration also, which is not only the state, it's below the state. The end of the basic civil service. I mean, unable to deliver a paper, unable to put you a stamp on something that you are making, unable to provide more than 2 hours of electricity. This is as basic as it is. So this is where also the state needs to be rebuilt and to be reconstructed.
It's quite something when the head of the Revolutionary Guards, senior Iranian officials come out and publicly threaten Saudi Arabia. And of course, the Saudis had intelligence by the Iranians in the making as a way to deter the Saudis from continuing to support some of these satellite channels that are beaming into Iran and supporting the protesters. So, and I really feel the escalation between Iran and Saudi Arabia, it's very unlikely to happen. This, of course, have implications elsewhere in the region, like in Yemen. Obviously, Iranians always have a preference to push back against their adversaries indirectly. And of course, pushing to Houthis to escalate, to renew attacks on Saudi soil is one way of doing that. And the more the regime is embattled, the more it would have an interest that an embattled regime will be forced to be focused internally. But there's 4-decade behavioral pattern of the Islamic Republic. And again, it usually becomes more aggressive in the region when it's more repressive at home. We saw a small episode of that in 2019. Remember, in 2019, there were also protests in Iran, and in a matter of 3 days, the regime killed 300 people. Now we're entering the 3rd month of protests, and more than 400 people have been killed, but there is the possibility of an incursion or an escalation in Iraqi Kurdistan. So the protests could have the kind of side effects that I think we're not paying enough attention to right now.
And Tarek, from the US perspective, we have obviously very shifting geopolitical picture in the Middle East. You have on one side dialogue with Iran is much